You have heard the stories. Floating above the body, watching from the ceiling, a tunnel with light at the center. Faces of people who died years ago, a life replaying in seconds. A boundary that felt permanent. You have heard these accounts from thousands of sources across decades. The same 5 stages in the same order from people who have never met each other. You assumed the experiences were either supernatural or meaningless hallucination. The physics explains a third possibility. Each stage maps to a brain region losing blood flow in a specific anatomical order. The heart has beaten approximately 2.5 billion times without being asked. The lungs have inflated approximately 600 million times without a conscious instruction. The brain has processed the visual field, maintained balance, regulated temperature, and produced every thought, including this one, using 20% of the blood supply through 2% of the body's mass, consuming more oxygen per gram than any other organ, running at a metabolic rate that makes it the first organ to fail when the supply stops. You have lived inside this machinery for decades. What happens when it stops? What does the brain do in the minutes between the last heartbeat and the irreversible silence? The physics has measured what happens. The physics has mapped the sequence. The physics has identified the regions and the order in which they fail. 5 stages. Reported across thousands of accounts, across cultures, across centuries, across every population that has documented the experience. Separation from the body. A tunnel with light at the center. An encounter with familiar faces. A review of the life in compressed sequence. A boundary with the sense that crossing means permanence. 5 stages in one order. Every time. The consistency across accounts, across cultures that have no contact with each other, across historical periods separated by centuries, argues that the sequence reflects something structural rather than cultural. The structure is the anatomy. The consistency is the vasculature. The sequence is reproducible because the blood supply architecture is universal. The anatomy determines the sequence because the blood supply determines which regions fail first. The sequence is consistent because it follows a physical order. The order is vascular. The experiences emerge from the anatomy as each region loses its blood supply. Each stage has a mechanism. Each mechanism has been measured. The physics does not diminish the experience. The physics locates each experience in a specific brain region, failing at a specific moment in a specific vascular sequence determined by the arterial anatomy every human shares. The location is the explanation. The explanation is the anatomy. What happens in the first 30 seconds? Blood supply determines the sequence. The sequence determines the experience. The experience matches the accounts because the anatomy is universal across every human brain. The regions fail in the same order because the arteries supply them in the same architecture. Heart stops, cardiac output drops to 0. Blood pressure in the cerebral arteries falls below the perfusion threshold within seconds. The brain, consuming approximately 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per 100 grams per minute, exhausts its dissolved oxygen reserve in approximately 20 seconds. The neurons that depend on oxidative phosphorylation for ATP production switch to anaerobic glycolysis, producing lactate and approximately 2 ATP molecules per glucose instead of the 36 that aerobic metabolism provides. The energy deficit is immediate and catastrophic. The brain consumes approximately 20 watts of continuous power under normal conditions, and the switch to anaerobic glycolysis reduces the available power by approximately 94%. The neurons are running on emergency reserves that deplete within seconds. ATP deficit becomes catastrophic within 30 seconds. The sodium-potassium ATPase, the membrane pump the panic discussion described, maintaining the -70 millivolt resting potential by pumping 3 sodium ions out and 2 potassium ions in at the cost of 1 ATP per cycle, loses power. The pump stops. Sodium floods into the cell through the voltage-gated channels that remain open. Potassium floods out through the potassium leak channels that were always open. The gradients that took the pump millions of cycles to build dissolve in seconds because the pump maintained an active gradient against thermodynamic equilibrium, and without the pump, thermodynamics wins immediately. The -70 millivolt gradient that every neuron depends on for every signal it has ever sent dissolves toward 0. The membrane depolarizes. The neuron can no longer fire action potentials in an organized pattern. The EEG, measuring the synchronized electrical activity of millions of cortical neurons, goes flat within 20 to 30 seconds of cardiac arrest. Isoelectric silence, the flat line, the clinical marker of electrical death that precedes biological death by 4 to 6 minutes. The brain is electrically silent. The cells are still alive. The gap between electrical death and biological death is where the physics lives. The neurons cannot fire organized signals, but the cells have not yet begun the irreversible calcium cascade that will destroy their membranes and fragment their DNA. The window between electrical death and biological death is where the 5 stages occur. Brain is dark, a city losing power district by district. Each district that goes dark produces a specific blackout effect the residents of that district experience. The grid failure propagates outward from the power source. The districts closest to the source lose power last. The districts at the furthest reaches of the grid lose power first. The brain is a city of 86 billion neurons losing its power supply, and the blackout propagates in vascular order from the regions with the lowest blood pressure toward the regions with the highest. The electricity that produced every thought, every memory, every perception for 6 or 7 decades has lost its power supply. Between this silence and the irreversible death of the cells, a window opens. 4 to 6 minutes at normal body temperature. Inside this window, 5 stages unfold in vascular order. Each stage begins when blood flow loss reaches a specific brain region and the neurons in that region fire their last organized activity before the membrane potential can no longer support signal transmission. The dying activity is the experience. The region is not producing noise. The region is producing its final output, the best signal the remaining energy can sustain. Each stage is a region dying. Each death produces an experience you recognize from every account they have ever read or heard. How does the body ownership circuit's failure produce the first stage? Stage 1. The temporoparietal junction. The cortical region where temporal and parietal lobes meet integrates body ownership signals, vestibular input from the inner ear, proprioceptive input from the muscles and joints, visual input from the eyes. The TPJ assembles these inputs into the coherent sense that you inhabit a body located at a specific point in space. The experience of being inside your body, looking out through your eyes, is a construction the TPJ maintains continuously from inputs it receives through separate sensory channels. Blanky and colleagues established this at the University of Geneva. Electrical stimulation of the TPJ in conscious epilepsy patients produced immediate out-of-body experiences. The patients reported floating above their own body, viewing the room from the ceiling, separating from the physical form. The stimulation disrupted the body ownership computation at the TPJ, and the brain's best interpretation of the disrupted signals was that the self had separated from the body. The TPJ constructs the body model in real time from converging sensory inputs. If the vestibular system says the body is horizontal, the visual system says the room is being viewed from above, and the proprioceptive system has gone silent. The TPJ resolves the conflict by generating the experience of floating above the body looking down. The out-of-body experience is the TPJ's best fit solution to contradictory inputs from a partially offline sensory system. Blanke published this in Nature. The finding was definitive. Disrupting the TPJ computation directly produces the experience patients report during near-death events. The stimulation was applied to conscious patients who were fully aware the experience was electrically induced, and the experience was still compelling, still felt real, still produced the spatial separation the TPJ failure generates during ischemia. Now, the TPJ sits in a watershed zone, the region between the middle cerebral artery territory and the posterior cerebral artery territory. Watershed zones receive blood at the lowest pressure in the arterial tree because they sit at the furthest reach of 2 supply networks, the overlap zone where neither artery dominates. When blood pressure drops during cardiac arrest, watershed zones lose perfusion first because they operated closest to the perfusion threshold even when the heart was beating normally. The margin was always thin. The watershed zone blood supply operates at the lower end of the autoregulatory range throughout life, compensating through vasodilation to maintain flow. When the heart stops, there is no flow to autoregulate. The margin disappears first where the margin was smallest. TPJ loses blood flow. The body ownership computation fails. The sensory integration that maintained the felt experience of being inside a body dissolves. The brain, still partially active in other regions, interprets the TPJ failure as separation. The separation is real as an experience. If you report floating above the operating table, watching the surgical team from the ceiling, seeing details they could not have seen from the table, is reporting the TPJ's best fit interpretation of sensory input from a body ownership circuit that has lost its primary inputs. The experience feels more real than a dream because the TPJ is producing a coherent spatial model from whatever residual inputs remain, and the brain has no mechanism for distinguishing a TPJ-generated model from direct sensory experience. The same neural architecture that produces normal body ownership produces the out-of-body experience. The architecture is working correctly given its inputs. The inputs are wrong because the sensory systems feeding them are failing. The mechanism is the failure of the circuit that maintained the body ownership model. First stage has begun. The blood flow loss continues propagating. The next region in the vascular sequence is the visual cortex, and its failure produces the most universally reported experience in the near-death literature. What produces the tunnel? Stage 2. The primary visual cortex occupies the posterior pole of the occipital lobe, wrapped around the calcarine fissure. The cortex maps the visual field retinotopically. The center of the visual field maps to the posterior pole where the cortical representation is largest, approximately 10 times more cortical surface area per degree of visual angle than the periphery. This cortical magnification means the central few degrees of vision receive disproportionate neural processing power, and during ischemia, those central neurons, with the richest blood supply, maintain function longest. The periphery maps to progressively more anterior regions where the representation is sparser. Blood supply follows an identical gradient. The posterior pole receives blood from the posterior cerebral artery. The more anterior regions of the visual cortex receive blood from branches with progressively less perfusion pressure. During ischemia, the peripheral visual cortex loses function before the central representation because the peripheral regions sit further from the arterial supply. Failure propagates from the edges of the visual field toward the center. The peripheral visual field goes dark first. The central field, supplied by the most robust arterial branch, survives longest. You experience a progressive narrowing of the visual field, darkness closing in from all sides toward a central region of remaining activity, the region where the arterial supply maintains the last residual function, a tunnel. Light at the center, darkness surrounding it. The most iconic image in near-death accounts is the visual cortex dying from the edges inward, the peripheral representation failing before the central representation, the arterial anatomy producing a progressive centripetal collapse of the visual field that the brain experiences as a shrinking aperture of light in a widening field of darkness. Well, the tunnel reframed the moment I understood, producing the most universally described experience in the near-death literature. The posterior cerebral artery supplying the central visual cortex survives longer than the branches supplying the periphery. The tunnel is the architecture of the blood supply mapped onto the architecture of the visual field. The light at the center is the last cortical territory with enough perfusion to maintain neural activity. The experience is the anatomy. The universality of the tunnel across cultures is the universality of the visual cortex blood supply across humans. Every human brain has the same cortical magnification at the posterior pole. Every human brain has identical centripetal ischemia pattern when blood flow drops. Every human experiences the tunnel because every human has identical vascular anatomy producing identical progressive failure in one direction. Visual cortex is dying from the edges inward. The blood flow loss continues. The next region to lose perfusion is the temporal lobe, and its disinhibition produces the third stage. How does the temporal lobe produce the encounter? Stage 3. The temporal lobe stores experiential memories, faces, voices, emotional associations, the composite representations of every person you have known. During normal function, the prefrontal cortex regulates temporal lobe activity through inhibitory connections, preventing the involuntary emergence of stored representations into conscious awareness. The inhibition is continuous, the temporal lobe contains the entire archive, and the prefrontal cortex determines which contents reach awareness. During ischemia, the prefrontal cortex, located in the anterior frontal lobe, one of the first regions to lose perfusion because of its watershed position, fails before the temporal lobe. The inhibitory regulation lifts. The temporal lobe, still partially active, begins firing stored representations without prefrontal oversight. Faces emerge. Voices. Emotional textures. The representations the temporal lobe fires are weighted toward the most deeply encoded, the most emotionally significant, the memories with the strongest synaptic weights, deceased family members, childhood figures, the faces the brain encoded most intensely. Penfield documented this phenomenon decades earlier through direct electrical stimulation of the temporal cortex in conscious patients. Stimulation produced vivid experiential hallucinations. Patients reported hearing music, seeing specific faces, re-experiencing emotional moments from decades past. The temporal lobe, when activated directly, replays its stored content as experienced reality. Penfield reported these findings across multiple landmark studies in the 1950s, establishing that the temporal cortex contains experiential memories that can be replayed as lived experience when the cortex is directly activated. The finding predates the near-death experience literature by decades and provides the neuroanatomical foundation. The temporal lobe contains the archive, and the archive plays when the cortex fires. Encounter is the temporal lobe playing its most deeply encoded content without the prefrontal filter that normally determines what reaches awareness. The faces are familiar because the temporal lobe preferentially fires its strongest representations, the ones with the deepest encoding from the most repeated and emotionally significant interactions. The deceased parent, the childhood friend, the figure associated with the strongest emotional bonds. These are the representations with the highest synaptic weights, the most robust neural traces, the ones most likely to fire when the inhibitory control that normally prevents their involuntary emergence dissolves. The emotional intensity is overwhelming because the representations carry their original emotional weights without the cognitive regulation that normally moderates emotional experience. The emotional intensity exceeds anything you has experienced during normal memory recall because normal recall is always filtered through the prefrontal cortex, which modulates the emotional weight of retrieved memories. During ischemia, the filter is offline. The raw emotional content of the strongest memories arise at awareness at full intensity, unregulated, overwhelming, feeling realer than any normal recollection. My understanding of the encounter shifted the evening the temporal lobe disinhibition reached specific anatomy. The deceased grandmother was a stored representation firing from the neurons that encoded her face during decades of childhood interaction. The emotional overwhelming was the absence of prefrontal regulation that normally controls the intensity of memory recall. The representation was real, encoded in real synaptic weights, stored in real neurons, fired as a real electrical pattern. The experience was the archive playing without editorial control. The temporal lobe has fired its strongest content. The blood flow loss continues. The neck structure is deep, ancient, and exquisitely sensitive to ischemia. What produces the life review? Stage 4. The hippocampus. The structure the name's discussion described as the processor that compresses experience into consolidation-ready packages for transfer to cortical storage during sleep. Hippocampal sharp wave ripples, 100 millisecond bursts that compress 10 minutes of experience into a fraction of a second. Fire during sleep as the consolidation mechanism that transfers the day's memories from hippocampal temporary storage to cortical permanent storage. Basaki identified these sharp wave ripples as the fundamental unit of hippocampal memory output, the mechanism by which the hippocampus communicates stored content to the cortex for permanent encoding. And then, the hippocampal CA1 region, the primary output layer, is among the most selectively vulnerable structures in the brain to ischemia. CA1 neurons begin dying earlier than almost any other cell type during oxygen deprivation because their metabolic demands are exceptionally high, and their tolerance for oxygen debt is exceptionally low. During ischemia, as the CA1 neurons approach death, they fire their contents in a massive cascade of sharp wave ripples. The dying hippocampus replays its entire stored archive in compressed seconds. Every memory, every encoded experience, every face, every place, every emotional moment the hippocampus ever processed fires in a cascade of compressed bursts as the cells discharge their contents before they die. Life review. Life flashing before your eyes. I is the consolidation mechanism, running at maximum output as the cells that store the memories fire every representation they contain before the calcium cascade destroys the synaptic architecture that has held them, in some cases, for 70 years. The memories play in temporal order because the hippocampal replay mechanism processes memories in temporal sequence during normal sleep consolidation, and the dying cascade follows an identical sequential firing pattern at accelerated speed. The temporal compression is extreme, a lifetime of encoded memories compressed into seconds. The compression ratio during normal sleep replay is approximately 100 to 1, 10 minutes of experience replayed in 100 milliseconds. During the ischemic cascade, the compression approaches the physical limits of the neural circuitry, the cells firing their contents as fast as the synaptic transmission speed allows. Each sharp wave ripple compresses a stored memory into a burst. The cascade fires ripple in temporal sequence, each one releasing a different memory, each memory playing at full emotional resolution, producing the life review as a temporally compressed but sequentially ordered replay of the entire stored archive. The emotional weighting is preserved. The most intensely encoded moments replay with their original emotional weight, which is why the life review is typically reported as emotionally overwhelming rather than neutral, the strongest memories carrying the strongest replay signals. 4 regions have failed. Each produced its stage. One final electrical event remains, and it is the most puzzling finding in the neuroscience of death. Why does the final stage feel more real than life? Stage 5. Borjigan and colleagues measured brain electrical activity in rats at the moment of cardiac arrest. After the EEG went flat, after the isoelectric silence the ATP collapse produced, a surge of coherent gamma oscillations appeared, 25 to 55 Hz, lasting approximately 30 seconds. The gamma activity during this surge was more organized, more synchronized, and at higher power than gamma activity during normal waking consciousness. Borjigan measured this in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Gamma oscillations in the 30 to 50 Hz range are the neural correlate most consistently associated with conscious awareness, sensory binding, and the unity of experience in living subjects. The dying brain produced more of this consciousness-correlated activity than the living brain in its final seconds. The finding challenges the assumption that consciousness diminishes smoothly as the brain dies. The electrical data shows the opposite. Consciousness-correlated activity increases to levels the healthy brain never achieves before the cells producing it lose their viability. The brain does not dim progressively. The brain brightens before it extinguishes. The brightening is the most challenging finding for any simple model of dying consciousness. The physics measures it. The physics does not yet explain why the dying neural tissue produces more organized activity than the healthy tissue it was moments before. Vicente and colleagues confirmed the phenomenon in a human patient in Frontiers in Aging, Neuroscience, the first documented human case where EEG recording happened to be running at the moment of unexpected cardiac arrest, capturing the gamma surge in a human brain dying while the instruments recorded every frequency band the dying cortex produced. The gamma surge appeared in the human brain following an identical temporal pattern the animal data predicted. The boundary experience, the sense that crossing means permanence, the feeling that reality has become more real than life, has a possible correlate. The gamma synchronization power during the terminal surge exceeded waking levels. If the relationship between gamma power and conscious experience intensity holds during dying as it does during living, the surge would represent the most intense conscious experience the brain has ever produced. The electrical measurement is established. The experiential interpretation is the inference. Whether the calcium cascade has progressed beyond recovery determines whether the 4 to 6 minute window has closed. Intracellular calcium rising from 100 nanomolar to micromolar concentrations activates calpains that digest structural proteins, phospholipases that digest membranes, and endonucleases that fragment DNA. Glutamate released from dying neurons activates NMDA receptors on neighbors, flooding them with calcium, spreading the cascade. Each dying neuron kills its neighbors through excitotoxicity, producing a wave of death that propagates through the neural tissue at a rate the declining ATP supply cannot counteract. The cascade is self-reinforcing. More dead neurons release more glutamate, which kills more neurons, which release more glutamate. CPR within the window restores oxygen, restarts ATP production, re-engages the sodium-potassium pumps, re-establishes the membrane potential, and pulls back every neuron that has not yet crossed the irreversibility threshold. Cold buys time. Hypothermia reduces the metabolic rate by approximately 7% per degree Celsius. extending the 4-minute window to 10, 20, or more minutes depending on the temperature. You, who was clinically dead for 20 minutes and recovered, often experienced cold water immersion, cold operating room temperature, or therapeutic hypothermia that slowed the cascade long enough for resuscitation to succeed. Whether the experiences you carry from a near-death event should be interpreted through neuroscience, through personal meaning, or through a framework that holds both is a question the physics teaches honestly but cannot resolve alone. The mechanism is measurable. The experience is reported. Whether the mechanism is the experience fully and completely remains the most honest boundary in the neuroscience of death. Heart stopped, the blood pressure dropped to zero, the brain exhausted its oxygen in 20 seconds, the membrane potential dissolved in 30 between the silence and the irreversible death of the cells. 5 stages unfolded, each one mapping to a specific brain region losing blood flow in a specific vascular order. The temporal-parietal junction lost its body ownership model and you separated. The visual cortex died from the edges inward and the tunnel appeared. The light at the center is the last cortical territory maintaining function. The temporal lobe fired its stored faces and the encounter began. The hippocampus replayed its entire archive in compressed seconds, and the life review played, a surge of gamma oscillations more organized than anything the waking brain produces, fired in the final seconds, and reality intensified beyond anything the living brain had experienced. 5 stages, 5 regions, 1 vascular sequence. Each stage a region failing, each failure producing the experience that region mediated. Each experience as real as any the brain ever produced, because identical neural machinery that produces normal experience produces the dying experience. The experiences are real to those who report them. The physics that produces each stage has been measured in every component. Whether the physics is the full explanation, or whether the physics reveals something the physics alone cannot explain, that question remains open. The individual components, every one of them, are established. The TPJ stimulation experiments are published and replicated. The centripetal visual cortex failure is documented. Vascular anatomy. The temporal lobe disinhibition is Penfield-era neuroscience. The hippocampal replay cascade is established memory physiology. The gamma surge is measured in animal models and confirmed in a human case. Each component stands independently on its own evidence base. No component requires the others to be valid. The assembly of these components into a unified sequential failure explanation for the near-death experience is the proposed framework, assembling established physics, not claiming proven causation. The brain produced its most organized electrical activity in its final seconds. 5 stages from 5 regions in one sequence that the anatomy predicts and the measurements confirm. The physics measured the activity. What the activity means, whether it is the brain's final metabolic discharge or something the physics alone cannot account for, is where the measurement ends, and the question the physics cannot answer begins. The honesty is the boundary. The physics explains each stage through a mechanism that has been measured. Whether explaining the mechanism explains the meaning is a question neuroscience holds open, because neuroscience has earned the right to hold it open through the rigor of the measurements it has already made.